Hi, everyone. Ever thought about working in the medical device industry, or are you in the industry and want to understand how to progress your career? Well, welcome to our podcast, Our Medtech Lives, in which we interview veterans of the medical device industry and learn about their career journeys, what they're most proud of, and the challenges they had to face along the way. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and we'd really appreciate your thoughts and comments about today's episode and any further questions that we should address. We're your hosts
Silke Riemer
and Kashikram. Today, we are honored to have Frank Jaskulke with us today. Frank is working with a company called Avia. That's a medtech consulting firm. And he has had an impressive career advising and helping medical device companies start up and go to market, and has a lot of C-suite experience as well, sitting on boards, also helping companies in their early stages bringing their innovative products to market. So without further ado, welcome, Frank, to Our MedTech Lives.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today.
Hi, Frank. When I came across your LinkedIn profile, the first thing I saw was your headline, which is Change Your Story, Change Your World. What does that mean for you? Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, credit for that goes to Seth Godin, the marketing author, who also is a biomedical engineer. He has this idea that we tell ourselves stories and we tell other people stories, and those stories shape the world we live in. So if you don't like the world you live in, he recommends one of the starting points being, well, change your story. And I use this a lot in my career, where a lot of my work was about creating things that didn't yet exist. And the first step was often to tell a story about that world I wanted to exist and try to get people on board with it. So it's a message that has resonated with me for a very long time.
Interesting.
That's really interesting. So I've touched a little bit about, your early career, but tell us about, where you grew up, went to university, and how you started your career, and love to hear some of your background.
Yeah. So I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the Uptown neighborhood, which, if anyone listening, if you're a fan of Prince,
Yes,
that's
very
the
much.
album Uptown. Yeah.
Okay, Uptown.
So
Yeah.
hung out in all those areas. Prince was around, like he was a true blue Minnesotan.
Yes.
Went to the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities campus, and studied American Indian policy and law. The American Indian movement started in Minnesota back in the 60s.
Okay.
And it was just always a fascinating area of study and like activity for me. Had no relation to what I ended up doing for my career. But when I went to school, I wanted to learn things I was interested in because I figured I'd be more motivated. Coming out of college, the original thought was go into policy.
Right.
Go work at the state legislature, maybe eventually in the federal government, and advocate for better policy, mainly around science and technology. That was always an interest. Science is an area that likes to think of itself as objective, but often what we're researching, what we're developing is influenced by the political environment and the policy environment.
Yes.
And I thought we could benefit as a society from having people who could speak a little bit of science and a little bit of policy and translate between the two. And that's become a bit of a theme throughout my entire career now.
Yeah, super interesting. So you did some early counseling work as well, I saw.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I have a very good friend who, at the time, she was doing fundraising for a charitable organization here in Minnesota called Camp Heartland.
Right.
And it was a kids camp for children that had or were impacted by HIV and AIDS.
Wow.
So when the AIDS epidemic first hit, in the 80s, we didn't know a lot about it. We didn't have treatments. So there were thousands of children who were born that were infected by their parent. They often were ostracized, didn't have access to good care. And there was a gentleman here who just decided one day to start a summer camp where those kids could go and have kind of a normal summer experience, right?
Wow.
They could be around others like them, be cared for, and just go and have fun in the woods, shoot bow and arrow, canoe, do all the normal
Amazing.
things.
Yeah.
And my friend invited me to come join for a summer, be a camp counselor, and it was transformative. And
Wow.
here are kids who many of them were from, the deep south in the United States or Los Angeles, like big cities, and we put them in the middle of nowhere woods of Minnesota, right? And they've
Okay.
never seen a canoe or a river, like
Right.
all these experiences they had just never had that I grew up with, and
Wow.
seeing them try those for the first time, get to enjoy them. It was
Yeah.
so enlivening. And then getting to learn about, how an organization that is mission driven, right? There is no product or service it
Yeah.
creates that you can sell for value, how you have to go and tell a story to
Yeah.
get people on board, to support it and to keep it going.
Yeah.
It was just a fantastic experience.
That's amazing. So you went from studying law, American Indian studies, to counseling. How did you end up in our industry?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of randomly. So
Yeah.
the next job
That's
I
a
got
standard
was,
answer, right?
yep.
In our
Well,
20,
podcast.
30 years ago, we were all falling into this industry.
it really is true. Like, I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's changing a bit, but a
Yeah.
lot of people, it was kind of like a circuitous route. And
Yeah.
once they land in it, they're like, oh,
Yeah.
this is where I was meant to be.
Yes.
Yeah. But so I'd applied for a job at our state legislature to
Yeah.
be a page, which is kind of the entry level political job. Like you literally,
Okay.
in the day, this is 20 years ago, but we still had
Yeah.
email. You would carry handwritten notes from one legislator to another. And the
Okay.
idea was it was a way to get people plugged in, give them
Right.
experience. I had applied for it. I interviewed. I did not get the job. They were
Okay.
hiring 50. I was 51 on the list. But on
Okay.
day one, someone didn't show up.
Oh,
And so
lucky.
they called me and they're like, if you can get here in an hour, the job is yours.
Wow.
Yeah. So got there, got the job, and I ended up being assigned to
Yeah.
the Commerce Committee, which at the
Okay.
time was working on legislation to
Yeah.
fund a big partnership between the University of Minnesota and Mayo Clinic.
Right.
And so I staffed that committee, learned about biotech, and
Yeah.
found it just fascinating. Learned about an organization called Medical Alley. They were lobbying for this legislation. I got to connect with some of their staff. Session ends. I went and applied for a job there. Had met a
Yeah.
couple of people. They knew me. They hired me to work the front desk. I was the receptionist. I got the mail. I answered the phone. Did whatever they needed done. And
Yeah.
that started what became a 19 and a half year career working at the
Wow.
trade association.
Amazing. Amazing. So tell us about this Medical Alley Association, because I was reading about it on your LinkedIn and it sounds fascinating. So let's deep
Yeah.
dive a bit on that.
Yeah, so Medical Alley Association's a not-for-profit trade group. It's the
Mm.
industry association for Minnesota's healthcare industry. The
Okay.
device, the drug, the biotech, the hospitals, the insurers. What's really unique about it is it was founded in 1984 by Earl Bakken, the founder of
Right.
Medtronic.
Founder of
Yeah,
Medtronic. Yes.
right. So Earl had this vision, in 1984, healthcare became the largest industry in Minnesota. So
Yeah.
historically as a state, it was timber, agriculture, mining, heavy manufacturing. But in the 80s, the industries really started to shift into technology. We had
Right.
healthcare growing, the computer industry,
Yeah.
what became the big supercomputers all over the world were designed and built here. But
Yes.
then they fell apart, and
Uh-huh.
Earl went and hired all these engineers. It helped to grow Medtronic, but
Yeah.
he thought, gosh, we just lost this industry in
Yeah.
computing. What if that happened to healthcare? And
Right.
so he went and got the other industry leaders and said, we should create an entity whose job is to make sure this healthcare industry we have remains viable, it grows, and it
Yeah.
contributes to people's health. So he set up Medical Alley as an entity to bring all the competitors together.
Okay.
And anyone who works in the industry, trade associations are a thing, but most of them are very focused on government affairs, on public policy. For
Yes.
Medical Alley, that's a tiny, tiny part of the work. It really was about building the industry up. And in fact, Michael Porter, the famous Harvard
Yes.
professor, wrote a
Yes.
paper on Medical Alley in the 90s. So Massachusetts has this big device industry, but in the 90s, for some reason, it slowed down in growth and Minnesota's accelerated.
Right.
And state of Massachusetts hired Michael Porter to look into it. And what he concluded was
Yeah.
in Minnesota, because of Medical Alley,
Yeah.
there was a level of collaboration, even among competitors, to solve problems around workforce, new technology development, policy issues, capital for startups, that just meant that anytime an issue emerged, this industry in Minnesota was more able to respond and keep growing.
Right.
Whereas the industry in Massachusetts, it was very competitive.
Yes.
They didn't help each other. When problems arose, they hoped it would take out their competitors, and it slowed growth.
Yeah.
So Michael Porter recommended that Massachusetts create its own Medical Alley, which became then MassMedic, an organization that's been around now for 25 years doing similar work. Fast forward to today, Medical Alley's still around. It's the 40th anniversary this year in 2024. It's about 800 member companies from all over the world who have come together to invest in the ecosystem, try and make healthcare better. And I feel very proud to say that, having spent 20 years there, we did projects that brought billions of dollars of investment to the state, helped startups get acquired or raise capital, and that I always think the people in the medical device companies, they were doing the hard work,
Yeah.
but we did pieces of work that made their work a little bit easier. And it made me always feel like I had at least a fingernail of effort on all these little products that were helping people around the world. And it just, I don't know, it was something that I think the whole community was able to feel proud of.
Yeah. 100%.
That sounds fascinating. But today, Frank, you are with Avio Medtech Consulting. What kind of consulting are you offering there?
Yeah, so Avio, it's a really unique consulting group, right? There are lots of great consulting organizations around the world who do similar things, right? We do quality, we do reg, we do R&D program management, and we do strategy, but only for startups and only in medical device.
Okay.
What makes us unique is how we were founded. So our founder's a serial medical device entrepreneur and investor. As she was starting companies, she would constantly have these challenges of having to project manage a dozen different consultants, right? She wasn't the CEO, she was the chief project manager. And that consumed time, it was expensive, and it wasn't very productive. She thought there had to be a better way. So she created Avio as an integrated model. Even if you only hire us to do reg, our reg people understand quality and R&D and go to market. And they're not thinking about how do I get you market approved? They're thinking about how do I get you market adopted? And so that I think is really the secret sauce.
Yeah.
And what exactly is your job there at Avio?
Yeah, I've got the sales and marketing side. So we've been fortunate that since founding, the company has grown rapidly, entirely organically. But now we're at a size, about 17 people, where to keep that growth up, it can't just be organic, inbound, things that get referred to us. So now we're being more proactive about going out into the market.
Fascinating. So let's say I've got an idea for a medical device, right? And I've kind of put together an initial prototype. What are the essentials I need to now consider about bringing my medical device to market?
Yeah, the first thing we always do is we check what kind of market validation have you done,
Okay.
right? There's lots of great ideas. There's lots of great clinical problems that aren't business problems, and you can't build a business around it.
Yes.
And like it or not, that is the model that we have around the world for how new health innovations get to patient care. So the first thing
Can
we
you give
do
us an
is,
example for this, that there is no business need for it?
Like one that comes up a lot, or two that come up a lot.
Yeah.
One, neuro rehab robots for post-stroke care.
Yeah.
I've
Okay.
seen hundreds of these from academics around the world
Yeah.
where they want to sell a $250,000 robot that helps a stroke patient do physical rehab.
Yeah.
Big clinical problem, shortage of labor to do rehab. It's inefficient. But in most countries, it's poorly reimbursed
Yes.
and the PT therapy works well enough. So
Yeah.
justifying buying a very expensive robot that you're not going to get reimbursed for, just clinical problem, but not good business. The
Yes.
other one I
Right.
see a lot is in diabetic ulcers, where huge clinical problem.
Mhm.
Tons of technologies that could go upstream and prevent it.
Yeah.
But in most countries, the reimbursement is just really bad for that. And the companies largely aren't willing to do the large clinical studies to create new reimbursement and drive adoption.
Yes.
So clinical problem, but not a business problem you can solve.
Right. Interesting. I mean, so this market entry is really complex, right? So it sounds
Mm.
like you've got to have a market that's reimbursed, right? But you also need to have regulatory approval. Compliance and standards need to be upheld
Oh
or
yeah.
even in some cases created, right? And it sounds from what you said that you really need to understand what the market needs, right?
Yeah.
So how would you help a company start to think about these challenges?
Yeah, and my approach and our approach to this is we start with where the company's at and we try
Yeah.
to understand what do they know, what don't they know,
Okay.
looking at the market. Have they validated the market? Is it sufficient for them to be able to make a profit in? If the market's $100 million and it'll cost you $100 million to get to market, you
Yeah.
probably don't have a business, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Then we want to dig into what is the reimbursement environment? What's the
Yeah.
channel environment,
Right.
right? Like maybe there is a market, but the channel is really expensive to sell into. Well, we might have to rethink it.
Yeah. So
Then we'll
let's
go,
just pause there a second
yeah,
because for people who may not be familiar with reimbursement, right? So a medical device and a drug, goes into a hospital and gets used. Somebody has to pay for it, right?
yeah,
Now, depending on where you are in the world, is different models, right? So either the patient pays directly, he gives the
mhm,
hospital the money in private hospitals or in some healthcare systems, but in generally in health in Western healthcare systems, somebody is paying for that either
mhm,
through tax dollars or through medical insurance, right?
yep,
And
yeah,
the amount of money allocated to either the procedure or
mhm,
specifically the device is what we call reimbursement, right?
yeah. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of companies, they don't spend enough time understanding how that money flows.
Yes.
They think like, oh, the reimbursement is to me, to my product, when usually, right, it's to the procedure, to the
Yes.
hospital, to the doctor, and you're
Yes.
trying to carve off a piece of it, not the totality.
Correct. So there could be like a hospital gets 20,000 for this procedure, but in that cost is the anesthesiologist, the
Hmm.
OR room, the the
ICU,
surgeon,
maybe.
Hmm.
ICU may be included, all the products for everything from the drapes and the gown that you wear going
Yep.
in to the drugs that you. So there's so much wrapped up that a hospital business person has to figure out how do we get this procedure done for that amount of money and still make a profit on it.
Yep.
Right? Yeah. So if you come with a product that's 10,000 on a procedure that's reimbursed by 20,000, then yeah,
You're
it's
going
not
to
going
have
to
a
fly.
problem.
Right. I mean, you could petition to have a change of reimbursement,
Hmm.
right? And then some companies have done that. Do you have any thoughts about how
Yeah.
easy or how possible that could be?
Yeah. It's not easy, but it is
Right.
possible. And this is
Mm.
where I think sometimes companies don't think enough about, are they going after a big enough problem, right?
Yes.
So if if you are going after a big clinical problem in a big market and you have a big solution, your most viable path might be to go and get higher reimbursement, get new
Yes.
codes. That takes years and it
Yes.
takes large clinical studies. But if the market is big enough and the clinical impact is big enough,
Yes.
startups do it, big companies do it, and it can be a worthwhile investment. But if you don't, or if you're not big enough, then you
Yes.
really need to figure out how you fit into existing reimbursement and existing workflow.
Yes.
The worst situation to be in is you're an incremental improvement and you're trying to get premium payment.
Yes. Yeah, that's
But
going to be tough.
let's go one step back, because now we are already pretty far in the product development. But let's say you agree with me that my product has a potential for a business. How do I get funding? Which
Oh, yeah.
opportunities do I have?
Yeah, this is another area where we spend a lot of time with companies, and there's, I think, a lot of misunderstanding.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
venture capital is
Yeah.
how most of the, I'd call it like heavy duty, bigger market
Mhm.
medical device products get funded.
Right.
Venture capital in the US is about 1% of business financing.
Yes.
And it's about 600 companies a year in medical device. That is the sum total of
Wow.
medical device venture funding. And that's new companies as well as existing companies getting their second, third, or fourth round of investment.
Right.
So venture capital is one segment. If a company's going to pursue that, they should have a very large market, an expert team who can execute against that market, and a clear plan and timeline of how they're going to create value, right? Like that is a small percentage of the startup community is going after venture capital. But if you fit the criteria, it's probably the best path to go.
Yeah.
If you don't fit that criteria,
What other opportunities do I have if
yeah.
I cannot get the approval by VC?
Yeah, so if you're not a venture backable company, which most companies aren't, then you're usually looking at angel funding, individual investors, strategic partnerships. If you have a
Right.
technology that might slot into the sales bag of one of the large corporates, they might be willing to fund an R&D program. Grant funding is quite extensive, and I would say especially if you're not a US company, European companies, Asian Pacific companies, the non-dilutive, the public or the grant funding that is available is 10x the kind of money that you find in the United States. And I think there are a lot of, I'd say particularly, I see this in European companies who don't take advantage of that money. And by that, I mean they get the money, but they haven't aligned to their go-to-market strategy. And so they spend the dollars on a lot of R&D, but it doesn't actually move them towards market release and market adoption.
Yeah. I think
But
that's
how do I
absolutely
get in
right.
touch with all these people? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
when normally, I was in a very early startup company, and normally they have engineers who suddenly want to start a medtech business. How do they get in touch with these, whoever, angels, VCs?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say on that is it is really hard. If a company is going to go and raise equity capital from angels or from VCs, a couple of things you're going to have to do. I mean, one is set up well, build out the pitch deck, build out the legal documents. Then it's the actual act of going and finding those investors. If it's VCs, it's relatively easy because they actually have a website. You can look them up on LinkedIn, right? Like they're in the business of deploying capital. Angels, much harder because that could be an individual who doesn't want people to know that they got a lot of money.
Yeah.
There are angel groups, there are angel networks. You can find those online. You start networking into them. I will say buyer beware. Most of the groups are quite good, but there are a lot of people who try to take advantage of these entrepreneurs who don't know what they're doing. So like a couple of things, at least in the US context, unless someone is a registered broker, it's pretty much illegal for them to charge a fee to bring you investors. It is also illegal for you as a company to offer a finder's fee for someone who brings you investors. And anyone who offers to do that, if they are not a registered broker, close the door, walk away. They're going to rip you off.
Okay.
Anyone who offers to help make intros and is not asking for money, take the intro. You never know where it's going to go. You're going to get no most of the time. Get used to that. Ask why the no. Learn from it. Refine. Always remember that you know your company really well, but when you're asking other people for money, they're putting their money at risk. They need to be convinced. It doesn't matter if you think you have the greatest thing ever. You need to understand how the investor is thinking about it. What do they care about? And usually that's how are they going to get a financial return, right?
Yeah.
We're all in this industry because we want to help people. But once we start making investments, we also want to know how are we going to get a return? So it's knock on a lot of doors, go to a lot of networking events, but oh man, it's hard. It is really hard.
Yeah, you've sparked my curiosity here, right? So you're absolutely right. In Europe, there are a lot of funds that you can apply to, go present. Sometimes it's very like a competition, and then they decide, and that's very early stage funding, usually projects that are spinning out of universities and stuff like that, right? But so if I'm got this idea, and I'm, like you said, it's very difficult with VCs, and the VCs, they are used to risk. I mean, they will invest in probably 10 companies with that fund, expect 2 to 3 of them to pay them back, and several to fail, right? That's part built into their business model. But obviously, they're not going to bet on absolutely anybody, right? They're not going to invest in everything. So when I walk into that room with a VC, what can I say? What should I not say even to blow it, right? What would you, why would a VC say no to me, for example?
So the way I think about this is everything is about risk management.
Right.
And fundamentally it's about technical, clinical, and market risk,
Okay.
right? Often these early stage teams, they know what to do on the technical side, right? It's a university professor, it's a doc, it's an engineer. Technical risk, great. A lot of VCs are fond of saying, assume the science works, so what? And that's where you get into clinical and market risk.
Right.
So what you want to do as a team is show how you're going to reduce technical, clinical, and market risk. Market risk you usually reduce in 2 ways. One is by having a great market, and then 2 is by having a team, whether it's on staff or on the board, that are capable of commercializing. Even if you're never going to be the company to commercialize it, they're going to want to know you have people who could commercialize it. The clinical risk, that's where you got to get really good help and advisors, the CROs, the reg people, know the market, and then know what is the clinical evidence that's going to be required to get market adoption, not market authorization, right?
Okay.
Getting a 510K is great. Getting the CE mark is great, but that doesn't mean someone will buy. It just means you can sell.
Yes.
And then the technical risk is usually the area where they have the least concern, unless it is a truly novel technology where there still is science to be done. And at that point, it's probably not venture capital that's going to be funding it. It's going to be grants. It's going to be on the research side. So think about technical, clinical, and market risk and how you can reduce each of those to get the investor more comfortable.
Frank, I have another question. When I do all these efforts, I also want to protect my product, right? So let's talk a little bit about patents. Is this always worldwide, or is it not affordable to do it worldwide? How does that work?
Yeah, right. Like, so IP is foundational for a medical device company because you're building new technology and you don't want others to copy it, right, without your permission. But it does get very expensive. We usually tell startups that, your IP and legal costs, which is more than just IP, so your total legal costs is going to run $50,000 to $100,000 a year in those early years of a company. If you have a lot of patents, that can go up, right? But for early stage startups, 50 to 100 grand a year is kind of ballpark in the US context. as far as like the worldwide side of it, doing the PCT application is always useful. Generally, you want to be protected in the largest markets, right? US, EU, China, maybe Japan, India. But then eventually you have to make some decisions. And the way I think about this is, as much as you may think your product is great, no
Yeah.
one's actually ever heard of it. Like, truly, no one on earth knows what you're doing,
Yeah.
right? And even if they did, they're probably not gonna copy it. Like,
Right.
really, truly, they're just busy, they're working on other stuff, they're probably not gonna copy it. So you get good IP counsel, but yeah, you don't have to try to protect it in every single country on earth on day one.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Silicon Valley, bank that funded, or the VC bank recently went bankrupt, right?
Well, they
Um,
nearly bankrupt. They're actually
right.
still around and
Oh,
growing
they are.
again. Yeah, they
Right.
had a bank run and got recapitalized,
Exactly.
thankfully. Yeah.
Oh, they got recapitalized. Oh, fantastic. So yeah, I was going to ask, is that had a major impact on today's VC environment? Has that made people more risk averse? Because I know that bank was very specialized in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It, um, we saw more of the impact in 23. I think this
Right.
year we've recovered from it. So a lot of the venture capital funds in the US and worldwide used SV Bank as their
Yeah.
bank, right? So literally, like we had companies here in Minnesota who couldn't access their cash to make payroll
Right.
because it was frozen.
Yeah.
There were companies that went under, there were venture funds that went under. It had a real impact. We thankfully have recovered from that. The data out of JP Morgan is showing that this year should finish in the US context up for total capital deployed in medical device over 2023. But that was
Yeah.
with a Q1, Q2 was weak. Q3, Q4 have been extra strong.
Wow. So and I heard a lot of people on the investor community saying that, this year, maybe end of last year and this year, it has been tough to get investment, right? So based on that, we've got our device, we've sorted out the regulatory, the IP. Where in the world does it make sense to go? Because obviously the US is the biggest market, right, in terms of revenue and volume. But does it make sense? Is it always US first? I mean, what would you advise companies like from a European standpoint, a European company, where do we take our product first?
Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's always facts and circumstances of the company. I would start with looking at where is your market the
Mhm.
largest and most profitable, and that may be the
Okay.
US. It may be a specific country in the European Union. It may be a state, right? Like
Okay.
when we talk about US market, I often encourage companies to think of the US as 50 countries, right? Like
Mm.
California is 40 million people.
Yeah.
Minnesota at 5.8 million people is the size of Denmark,
Yeah.
right? Like the US states are markets in their own right. So
Yeah.
I would actually do the analysis going down a level and look at like each European Union state, the UK, and then each US state and figure out where might be a concentration, a prevalence and incidence, or the right kinds of customers, or better
Yeah.
reimbursement rates, and get really narrow in launching.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd suggest is, especially if you're a European company, think about the US market as like the big, big market and
Mhm.
understand what that market will need to be successful. And then go and leverage the various European Commission and country level grants to
Yeah.
do work that advances you towards that effort. I have seen companies
Yeah.
coming out of different EU states that have got $3, 4, 5, $6 million of non-dilutive funding.
Yeah.
We have brought companies to market and scaled them on less than $5 million in capital.
Wow.
Like, if you spend that money well and in the appropriate market, you could go entirely non-dilutive to bringing a product to the US market. At that point, you could get an exit. And even if it's a small exit, you probably own 100% of the equity. right? 100% of a $10 million exit is a heck of a lot better than a 0.1% of a $100 million exit.
Yes.
But this is
Absolutely.
all economical discussion. But I have a question for the approval, because when we started in Medtech like 20 plus years ago, it was always like even American companies started in EU first because it was
Right.
easier to obtain the CE mark. While today it doesn't
Oh.
seem to be the case anymore. And even UK and Switzerland, I'm based in Switzerland, who are not part of the European Union, consider accepting the FDA approval in 2 years. So can you tell us a little bit how that changed and what do you think today?
It was the same for me at the start of my career. Every company was go CE mark first, come back to the US.
Yes.
US policymakers lamented that, we were getting last access to new innovative technologies, right? And then the European Union gave the United States what I think is one of the greatest gifts ever in blowing up the CE mark with the new MDR process, right? It is ground to a
100%.
halt. You can't get product through. My phone, when I was at Medical Alley when this happened, my phone just started ringing nonstop of European companies wanting to set up in the US first.
Yes.
I actually read this morning, just before coming on to do the podcast with you, an article that the new health commissioner, a Hungarian gentleman, has announced that they are planning a full review of the process after intense lobbying by everyone to try to fix the process that's been created. I think it'll bounce back. I'm already hearing from companies in maybe the last year or so of maybe some of the initial challenges have been overcome. It's still slow, but it's moving again. But it has created, I think, a permanent change in how companies will go to market, including with what like UK and Switzerland is doing. I suspect a few other countries might do a similar thing. Like you can see the Nordic countries doing that as well, where they have a different relationship to the European Union, and it creates a path where if you get FDA, well, you now have access to a bunch of other relatively large markets. I'll get to CE mark, later.
Yeah, I think I think the MDR started from a good place, from a good thought, because I think CE mark was probably not as stringent as the FDA, right? But the pendulum swung way too far, right? And now where it became a burden. And I know working on commercial in the startup area, a lot of companies telling me, "Hey, Cash, we're not coming to Europe just yet. We're going to go in the US," right? And so, yeah, it has absolutely done a huge favor for the US market, and that pendulum now needs to come back. It's going to take a little while for that to get fixed because it's a bit of a bureaucratic process, right?
Yeah. But what
So
you
really,
said
the
is really
option,
important, that
yeah,
the CE process did need fixing,
yeah,
right? Like
it did.
we always thought of it as it was a more of a quality system,
Yes,
right? Than in the US context, FDA is safety and effectiveness.
yes.
There was definitely need for reform.
Yeah, somebody explained to me, like, if you described how you're going to make a product and then you made the product exactly to that specifications, you got CE mark. Now, whether that medical device product was effective wasn't
Whole
really
different
part of the,
question.
right? It wasn't. It was just make that catheter exactly how you specified it at the beginning. Just keep making it that way. Now, does that catheter add value? That wasn't answered by CE. So that was why. So now, as a European company, going the MDR route is lengthy, it's complicated. So, okay, I switched to the US, but going to the US is also fraught with complication for a European company. I mean, we could make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
What mistakes are you seeing companies do?
Yeah, the most common ones that I end up seeing are, one, they think about the US instead of
Yeah,
breaking it down at the state level, right? The United States is physically large and it's a huge population. Limited market release is your best friend. Like even the big companies don't always do a full US launch when they're launching a new product.
right.
The second one that I see is they make an assumption that because there's big industry and there's a lot of venture capital, that capital is easy or easier to access.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also that there's a lot more competition for that capital. The third one I see is lack of market validation. It is highly probable that whatever you're working on, someone else has tried it before or a similar thing, or there's an existing solution, and you've got to demonstrate why your approach is better. I see a lot of times where companies think they're novel, but they actually haven't validated that they are novel. And then maybe
Right.
the final one that I see is cost. The US is expensive. Like it is way, way more expensive for everything here.
Yes.
Salaries are much higher,
Yeah.
costs are much higher. And so
Yeah.
companies sometimes get sticker shock when they come
Mm.
to the US where they're like, oh, the market's going to be huge. Yeah, but you're also going to need a lot more money to get to
Yes.
that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
When
Yeah.
when you
Go ahead.
recommend to go to a single state, would you go for a big or for a small one to balance the risk and the outcome?
I'd give two answers. I'd say I think it's different about where you launch versus where you operate, right?
Okay.
So
Mm-hmm.
where you go launch your product to sell,
Yeah.
that I think should be wherever you believe you have the best chance of generating good sales. And that might be
Mm-hmm.
going to Texas Medical Center with all the hospitals, or it might be going to a heart clinic in Arkansas because they have
Yeah.
a high volume of patients and there's a KOL doc who's interested in your product,
Right.
right? But
Mm-hmm.
that you're going to have a sales rep, maybe a distributor. That's not necessarily where you're going to operate the business.
Mm-hmm.
For operating the business, if you're in medical device, I would argue there's three places in the US you can be: Massachusetts, Minnesota, and California. And in picking among those three, the way I'm biased, of course, but the way I think about it is, what kind of technology are you in? Minnesota's heavier on cardiac and neuro and on class 3 complex devices. Massachusetts is heavier on surgical. California does everything. Like they
Right.
just are gigantic. Second thing I'd think about is cost.
Mm-hmm.
California is going to be your most expensive. Minnesota is going to be your least expensive. Massachusetts is in the middle. And then the third I'd think about is logistics. And this is one where Minnesota does have a natural advantage. I can fly from Minneapolis to London in the same amount of time as I can fly from San Diego to Boston. So if
Right.
you're on one of the coasts, you're basically internationally traveling if you need to go visit a customer on the other coast.
Yeah.
Minnesota's in the dead center of the country. You can get to anywhere in North America in under 5 hours.
Wow. And on the marketing and distribution side, I mean, you've decided to go to California and certain states, and as you said, the ticket price for the US is a lot. I mean, what should I consider? What are the options I've got? Direct, indirect sales, partnerships?
Yeah.
What's the decision-making process here?
Yep. I mean, and this is a very complicated and fraught process for a lot of companies because, right, they're putting a lot at risk. So you have
Yeah.
direct, your own sales force; indirect, say with a distributor; and
Yeah.
then indirect with a strategic partner.
Yeah.
I think each of them actually are equal. It depends on the market. So if you have a large, complex market where you're going to have to do market development, right? You're going to have to
Yeah.
train docs, develop clinical evidence. I think you have to go direct on that. It is
Right.
hard to get a distributor motivated to do a bunch of extra work and they're going to get paid the same,
Yeah.
right? If you're in more of an established product and market, it's sort of a me too, like it's a better version of an existing thing. Distributors could be very effective because
Yeah.
they can bring it in, they already got the channel, they've got the logistics, not a lot of
Yeah.
training needed.
Right.
The strategic partner route can be really good if you think that's where you might end up getting acquired or it's a very long-term strategy. I think up front it can be risky in the sense that your product is likely to get deprioritized any moment that strategic has a new product launch or something else going on, right? Their product is always going to be first in whatever they're doing. But if you're making a device that say is a tool to complement a procedure, right? A delivery catheter for a TAVR valve or something.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you've developed a better one. One of the strategics, they're focused on the next valve, not the delivery system. So you could bring them a lot of value by bringing them that product, and they don't have to develop it internally. So I think it starts with your market and your technology platform, and that can drive what's the right path, direct, indirect, or partnered.
Yeah. I also in the US, when you think of the US healthcare market, it's a very litigious society, right? That's always going to be in the back of my mind about, product liability, litigation. What advice would you give me on that front?
Yeah. So I think
Yeah.
companies have more fear of it than the reality. And
Okay.
what I mean by that is if your product causes harm, yeah, we're going to sue the heck out of you and put you in jail, and we should,
Yeah.
right? So what should you do?
Yeah.
Develop a safe and effective product,
Right.
right? Do good clinical studies, do good benchtop testing.
Yeah.
You know, if you do the things that demonstrate the product is safe and effective, and then in manufacturing, you do the right things so it is manufactured well, you
Yes.
by and large are going to be safe from litigation. The
Okay.
problems usually arise when, and I see this far too often from companies, when they cut corners,
Yeah.
right? They skirt on testing. They don't use good quality management in their manufacturing. They make medical claims that are unsupported. I saw two
Mm.
companies this week where they
Yeah.
had on their website unapproved medical devices for sale.
Oh,
That's illegal. You're gonna
yes.
get arrested and sued, and you're gonna cause problems. But if you don't do those things, by and large, you won't have to worry about it.
Yeah. See, I told you, Silke. You got to get everything tested properly before you go.
It's not my website.
But, but if you get arrested, I will definitely come and visit you. I'll
Thank
bring
you
in a
very
cake
much. I
with
appreciate
a saw-shaped cake. Okay.
Frank, we discussed a lot about the status quo at the moment, but I would like to take a moment to have your thoughts on the future. I mean, we see a lot of things happening in Europe and China, and of course, we all look at the results of the US election. What do you think will be the impact on export, import of
Yeah.
healthcare products?
Yeah, I mean, I think the base case for most people is that tariffs are likely to go up, which will likely lead to retaliatory tariffs. And I don't think
Yeah.
any of us are excited about any of that,
No.
right? Anything that increases prices, not good.
Yeah.
Anything that might complicate supply chains. And we are not that far outside of the pandemic times where supply
Yes.
chains were severely stressed. So I think there's a lot of risk in seeing economic slowdown, seeing price increases, where maybe the flip side of that is it's also a lot of really creative and smart people out there who, whenever a new wall is put up, find a way around or over it, right? So
Yes.
I don't think these are permanent barriers. I think they create a temporary blip. What I don't know is temporary 3 months or three
Yeah.
years, right? TBD. The second thing I think a lot about is with the staff that might come in at HHS or the department in a US federal government where the FDA sits,
Yeah.
right? There are significant and real risks in that people can come in that this is not a political statement, agree or disagree with their policies, but that could cause disruption in the staffing of FDA, which
Yeah.
could then lead to a slowdown in product approvals, a slowdown in inspections. That could have a real effect on companies all over the world coming into the market.
Yeah.
It may end up, I don't know if it would reverse, but it may end up ameliorating or moderating some of the impacts that the MDR debacle has had as far as European companies coming to the US.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that you're absolutely spot on. We're going into a period geopolitically where it is probably uncharted territory, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
the US with their election and the people coming in. But then in Europe, we have a war going on in Europe. So
Mm-hmm.
that's having an effect on healthcare and funding and how governments are thinking and operating. And then in
And we have the
Asia,
two
you got
major countries, Germany and France, with
yeah,
no real government at the moment,
right.
right?
Right.
So
French government
it's a lot of risk.
has disappeared.
Yeah.
And then in China, you have a big slowdown in their
Mm-hmm.
market as well, right? So that's having an effect across Asia. And Japan, we didn't mention Japan, but Japan is notoriously slow when it
Yep.
comes to market entry, right? I've never launched a product in Japan because usually we launch in Europe, then we launch in the US, and then Japan is so long. I'm usually on to another product before before we come up for the Japanese launch. That's why I've never launched. But yeah, geopolitically, it's going to be a very interesting place where there's going to be a lot of problems for people to solve, right?
Yeah.
So great for people to
And I
come
think
in.
that's the right way of saying it is there are going to be problems to solve.
Yeah,
It'd be very easy to get caught up in kind of a doom and gloom scenario.
yeah,
And there definitely is some doom and gloom, so I'm not going to discount it. But
yeah.
it's also we have to find ways to move forward and to make things work because there are patients who are depending on these innovations.
But I mean, I
100%.
think for innovations, maybe it's even easier because it's a new product and you go with these new challenges. But what about the existing ones where you have an annual contract with a hospital, prices are
Hmm.
fixed, and suddenly the price goes up? So I think
Oh,
this is
yeah.
a real challenge, right?
No,
For
no,
the
it's a
next
good
year or
point.
years.
Yeah, the existing products that are locked in probably have the least flexibility to
Yeah.
Yeah,
adapt to the environment. Um, it's probably really the new innovators where when in the US when we passed the ACA or Obamacare, it changed the market dynamics in healthcare, and it took a couple of years for innovators to figure out what the new dynamics were and then develop innovations that met those. Once they did, we saw this huge spike in innovation, but in
Hmm.
between, it was sort of like, just like trying to stay above water, just treading
yeah,
water and swimming, because everyone was uncertain what the new legislation meant. We're
yeah.
probably entering a similar environment, just on a truly global scale.
Yeah, so it seems like it's going to be a little bit more challenging to enter into markets. You really need to have done your homework
Hmm.
before you go in front of a VC or
Hmm.
before you go apply for your FDA or MDR and really segment out the world market to see where you want to go, right? So, it sounds like, with all these challenges, Avio Medtech is basically a good place to go to help thrash out some of these questions, right, Frank? And
We think
so
so.
how can people they can look you up on LinkedIn and get in touch with Avio on your website?
Yeah, aviomedtech.com is
Yeah,
the website. You can find me on
right.
LinkedIn, reach out
Yeah,
anytime. I am always glad to chat. And I'll tell you, even though we're a consulting firm, we got something to sell. I am
yeah,
truly committed to the innovation community, to the startup community. Any entrepreneur out there, if you just want to chat, you need some
yeah.
advice, you need connections, I will hop on a call anytime. I'm based in the US, but I do a lot of international work, so I'm up early, I'm up late. We'll figure it
Yeah.
out.
Yeah,
All right.
fantastic. No, we'll put your contact details as well
Thank you.
down
So
below.
this
So yeah, go ahead.
this
So
takes us to our final question, I guess.
Mm,
And this is always the same. If you follow our podcast,
hmm.
it's please tell us the 3 things you know now that you wish you would have known then.
Yeah. You know, first one would be slow down on everything. Like,
okay.
it always feels like, oh, this is so important right now. And I've learned that there are a lot of things that if you just wait a day, the problem might go away or become a
Mm,
lot different 24 hours later. Like, very few problems actually have to be dealt with right then.
mm,
Second, I wish I'd known earlier on to spend a lot of time networking. The network is so powerful. The people you know that you can call on for advice and for help to find new jobs, it is the difference maker in everything. Trusted relationships just make everything easier. And
Yes.
then the third would be, I wish I had known how much interesting innovation there is everywhere that is like kind of under a rock or not as well known, and that some of the best opportunities are not going to Silicon Valley or going to Oxford and Cambridge, but
Mm.
are going to smaller communities around the world that don't get the attention they probably deserve. And that's where you can find real opportunity, really interesting things to make a difference.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Frank. That's been amazing. I mean, whether you're, you know, working on a new project, you've got a new idea, or you're just like Earl Backen, who we mentioned earlier, tinkering away in your workshop, and somebody
Mhm.
comes to you with a problem like we have power cuts and we need to keep our patients who are on pacemakers alive.
Oh, yeah.
How do we do that, right? There's a lot of work that goes to bring in a medical device to market. And thank you for this discussion. For me, the time has absolutely flown by. We
Mhm.
covered all these topics. So thank you so much. And I would encourage anyone who's interested in this area to reach out to you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.